Dr. Hill, I got a question about our meeting this afternoon. Did you want me to use the same link that you emailed me the other day?
Yeah, it's a recurring link.
Okay, all right.
Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. So today what we're going to do is finish up the lecture for lecture 4, and then we will go over who's playing Jeopardy. Actually, let's do that right now really quickly. So don't forget you have a quiz today. So you need to take it sometime between 10 a.m. today and 10 a.m. tomorrow, with the exception of Joseph Justice. There he is. Carlos, where's Carlos? There's Carlos. Ethan McKenzie. So we have Ethan. There's Ethan. And John Minch. Where's John?
Got it.
There he is. Okay, so Joseph, Carlos, Ethan, John. Do not take your quiz today. You're going to take it live on Monday morning. Everybody else, make sure you take it sometime before Saturday at 10 a.m. All right? Questions? No questions? Okay. All right. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. Sorry, sometimes when I share the screen, I can't see the waiting room, and I heard that somebody was trying to get in. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so if memory serves, we had talked all the way up about post-secondary education, but we hadn't gone over the effectiveness yet, I believe. So just a brief overview, when we're talking about prison-based education programs, we are talking about literacy programs, so just basically teaching them to read, adult basic education, which is usually below a 9th grade reading level, secondary, which is working on your GED. That means you're at a 9th grade level or above, but you haven't graduated from high school or gotten your GED. Or there are post-secondary programs, which are college programs. So let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of those. So there have been several studies done on these, and they all kind of say the same thing. So that Anderson study that we saw in the previous slide, that was a really big study on education programs. So Anderson showed that college level programs reduce recidivism. Dew and Clark also, but also this Badiuk study in 2005, they actually showed that college level programs not only reduce recidivism, but they also increase employment, and they showed what we call a mediating effect. So they saw that participating in a college program increases your education outcomes, which then reduces recidivism. So that's kind of exactly what we would like to see, is that we get more education, we're employed, we're less likely to commit another crime. So this Badiuk study showed what we refer to as a mediating relationship. Employment is mediating the effect of participating in a college program and reducing recidivism. We also, just like the others, we saw small differences between the groups. So for instance, college level programs seem to work better for females that are younger, have a drug or non-violent offense, and no prior history of incarceration. You don't need to write that down. Just understand that there are usually minute differences. And this can be super helpful for a warden or a correctional administrator when they are trying to determine who goes into what program if they have a limited number of spots. All right, who wants to turn this into a policy outcome? Who wants to do it? Any volunteers? I know it's early.
I can draw it.
All right, let's hear it, John.
I recommend implementing college level programs because it reduces recidivism.
Perfect. Yep. You could also say employment. Either one of those works. All right. Very good. Okay. Let's talk about vocational education. So sometimes be careful when you're doing your research. So if you're looking at vocational education or education, occasionally you'll have studies that group them together. So be careful that you're not looking at a study like that. So education programs that we just talked about are basic academic education. but there are also vocational education programs in which you are learning a trade skill. And that's what, when we talk about vocational education, that's what I mean. You are learning a trade skill in a prison setting. So the rationale here is that ex-offenders have a high incidence of employment failure. So we want to teach them a trade skill so that they can more easily get a job when they are released. And we're hoping that will also lead to a reduction in recidivism as well. So the type of program that offers varies widely as far as the skill they are teaching. It really depends on the technical college that they are partnering with. But some common vocational programs that they offer, no problem, Juan. So some types of programs that they offer, you don't have to write all these down. I'm just going to give you a whole bunch of them. Web design, construction project coordination. These, I'm actually listing off all the programs that the state of Florida offered in their study. So HVAC, so heating and air conditioning, landscape irrigation, culinary arts, computer literacy, plumbing, computer network technology. So any of these things that usually require some sort of trade licensing that you can get from a technical college, those are the types of programs that we refer to as a vocational education that can be offered in a prison. So usually what we see here is anywhere from 100 to 300 hours of classroom-based education, followed by job training that can sometimes be done in the institution. And then occasionally you'll see apprenticeships as the last part of these programs, in which they'll go out on work release and be able to apprentice in these people's shops or with them throughout the day. But again, the type of program varies widely. The structure of it varies widely. It's hugely based on partnerships. So whatever the technical college can provide is kind of what the correctional institution will accept. So some might say we're only giving 100 hours of classroom-based education and no apprenticeship. So really, it just depends on what you can work out with this technical college. So another thing that varies widely is the ability to get your accreditation while you're incarcerated. So sometimes what these programs will do is give you all the skills that you need to take that accreditation licensing test, and then you can actually take it while you're incarcerated. So when you get released, you've got your license ready to go. Other programs will just give you all the knowledge that you need, and then as soon as you're released, you're ready to take that accreditation licensing test. It really just depends on the relationship that, or the partnership that they work out. Okay, so let's talk about how effective these programs are. So there are a lot of studies on vocational education programs. This Wilson and colleagues study from 2000 is a meta-analysis of 33 correctional evaluations of vocational programs. So almost 20 years ago, there were over 30 studies on this, and there have even been more since then. So Wilson found, so this is a meta-analysis. So remember what they're doing is they are finding what we call the average treatment effect. So across those 33 studies, they're coming up with the average outcome. So what they found was that on average, these programs can reduce recidivism by 22% and increase employment outcomes by 34%. So I'm going to give you the policy implication on this one because there's a very specific way that you say it when you've got numbers. So what you don't want to say is vocational programs can reduce recidivism by 22%, because you don't want to promise 22%. Remember, this is an average treatment effect. So what I recommend saying is that vocational education programs can reduce recidivism up to 22%. You don't want to promise 22% when we know there are all kinds of differences, right? So this was an average treatment effect. Not only that, but we see all kinds of differences in these programs. So you don't want to promise that if you implement this program, you're going to see this number, because what if, you know, this was based on HVAC stuff and you implement a plumbing program? Or what if this is based on 300 hours of education and they only do 100, you know? So there are all kinds of small differences in there. So whenever you see a number like this, there's basically two ways you can do it. You can just say, I recommend implementing vocational programs to reduce recidivism and increase employment outcomes, or I recommend implementing vocational programs to reduce recidivism up to 22% and increase employment up to 34%. You don't want to promise that number, so either leave the number out or just say it can do it up to this, right? So this leads into the next one. So the Specter study was one that I did with my major professor and another grad student when I was in grad school. So the Specter is a federal grant that the state of Florida got to implement 12 vocational programs in 12 prisons across Florida. So that list that I gave you with the following trades, the web design, computer literacy, those were all of the programs that the state of Florida was offering as a vocational program in their prisons. So each prison partnered with a nearby technical college and they offered one or two of these trades. They had the inmates receive 300 hours of vocational training in the classroom. Then they participated in a transition program where they received another 100 hours of employability skills. And then they were given the opportunity to attend a reentry seminar within the prison. So they invited people from the local communities to come into this prison and do sort of a reentry seminar with these people so that they could apply for jobs right there on the spot. So the inmates who fulfilled the 300 hours of vocational training and the 100 hours of the employability training were given what we refer to as a Specter certificate. So myself, Dr. Bales, and my friend Sam, we ran the analyses for this. And we looked at recidivism 3 different ways. We looked at rearrest for felony, reconviction, and reimprisonment within 3 years. And we saw that it could reduce recidivism between 3 and 11%. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I clicked the wrong thing. So we saw like reduced recidivism for rearrest for felony by like 3%, all the way up to 11% reconviction and re-imprisonment. So this is why you don't want to promise 22%, because in the state of Florida, we only saw reduced recidivism up to 11%. The one thing that we found that was kind of odd is we saw no effect on employment here. So there are a couple of reasons why we think we didn't see that effect. Sam, do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. When you say between 3 and 11, does that mean like one prison had like 6 and one prison had 11 and one prison had 7 and one prison had 3? Is that when you say between those?
No, it's based on how we were conceptualizing recidivism. So rearrest for felony, reconviction, and reimprisonment. That's why we see varies.
Yes, ma'am.
Got it. Okay, so we didn't see any effect on employment, which seems weird, right? That would seem like a normal outcome. One of the reasons we think that was the case was because just because someone's incarcerated in Allendale prison does not mean release, they're getting to Allendale, the city. So for instance, if Allendale, the vocational college there offers a culinary arts program, and this person gets released and they get shipped back to, I don't know, maybe Berkeley County or something like that, where they're from, and there's no culinary arts jobs, then that's not gonna increase employment. We went on and on about it, as researchers do, but that's one of the reasons why we think it didn't affect employment, because you learn one very specific skill, and if that isn't offered where you're released, then that's not really going to be very helpful. Either way, we did show that it reduced recidivism. We think that, you know, the exposure to working with working professionals, being able to show that they could do those 400 hours of training, that is kind of an indicator that they are going to do well when they are released. So that was one of the things that we said, is that if you see that this inmate has a Specter certificate, that's kind of an indicator that they're going to do well because they were able to do this program. Okay, questions about this? All right, let's talk about my favorite. So the dog training programs. So I have been studying this since I was a master's student. So I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. So dog training programs usually fall under the heading of prison animal programs. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk about a few other animal programs that are available in the state. So dog training programs are extremely popular. They started in the 1980s and they spread like wildfire. They are in prisons in all 50 states and in several countries, including England, Scotland, Canada, Australia. They are even in South African prisons. So they rely on partnerships, and usually the way this works is that, and we're going to go over the different program modalities in a minute, but the community service model basically, and this is the most common one, what you'll have is a local animal shelter will partner with a prison and send their dogs, send like a group of 8 to 10 dogs to prison to be trained and socialized by the inmates. Then they come back to the shelter and they go up for adoption to the general public. That is the common way that this is done. Either way, they rely on partnerships to provide the dogs. Usually they will have a local trainer that will go out and train the inmates to train animals. Usually they will do that as sort of volunteer work. So the first time that I was analyzing this program, I was a master's student, and the way it worked in Florida, I went to Perry Correctional Institution, and the local animal shelter had a trainer there. So the animal shelter would send the dogs, and they sent this trainer. His name was Jay King, and he would go about, when they first started the program, he went out like almost every day of the week for a month to train the inmates. They all got a training handbook, and he showed them how to socialize and to train the animals. He trained a good group of guys who then became the lead trainers, and then they worked in groups of 3. So they had a lead trainer, a handler, and another small trainer as well. So like you had the handler do like the day-to-day stuff, the trainer sort of give them the socialization, and then the lead trainer would come in and do the main training throughout. So they worked in teams of 3. Some institutions do that, some don't. Some allow the animals to live in their cells with them. Some of them have like a dog run at the back. Some of them have individual crates for the animals. Individual crates is actually pretty common if the animals are going to go back to the shelter. They learn the hard way that if you take an animal out of the shelter where they spend like most of their day in a pen, and then you sort of let them run free in the prison and then send them back into an animal shelter, they don't do really well. So they suggested keeping them kind of in a pen the whole time because they knew that they were going to go back and they didn't want to stress the animal out even more. All right. So there are all kinds of ways these programs can be implemented. The one that I just described is the community service model. That is the most common. You partner with a shelter. They send about 8 to 10 dogs to the prison. They're there for, 8 to 12 weeks. The inmates train and socialize them. All the while the animals are being advertised on their website as up for adoption. And you can even adopt a dog while it's in this training, and then go pick it up when they graduate from this training program. Some of these prisons even have cute little graduation ceremonies. I've attended a couple of them. So whenever the animals graduate from their training program, they will invite the people that adopted the dogs to the prison, as well as members of the community, and they have like a little graduation ceremony. And it's nice. You get to meet the inmate that trained your dog. You learn all about the animal, sort of things that they like, things they don't like. It's a really nice little ceremony.
I got a question real quick.
Yeah, what's up?
Were there ever situations or like certain scenarios where the prisoners were like released and like adopted the dog that they had trained?
Yeah, that's pretty common. What actually happens a lot is they will have a family member adopt the dog, and then when they get out, they take the dog. Yeah, that's a good question. That's really common. Another commonality is that the correctional officers adopt the dogs, and then the most recent article that I just published on this talks about how this reduces what we call the pains of imprisonment. Pain of imprisonment is anything beyond normal incarceration, things that make it even worse, make it even harder to adjust when you get released. And one of the things that these programs do is bring the inmates and correctional officers together, where usually there's that really negative relationship. You see inmates joking around and having fun with correctional officers. You don't see that with any other program. Usually they hate the correctional officers, but when a correctional officer adopts one of their dogs, all of a sudden they have something to talk about all the time. They show them pictures. It's just a way to sort of bring people together. All right, so community service model, that's the most common one. The other one that we see sometimes is service animal socialization. So anytime you have a service animal, whether it's a police dog or a dog trained for a veteran with PTSD, or for a child with disabilities, or they even train epilepsy dogs that can signal to the owner when they're about to have a seizure. Like they can smell when you're about to have a seizure. They let you know so that you can sit down or lie down. Or if they can't get to you in time, if you start seizing, they will get between your head and the floor so that you're not hitting your head on the floor. So all of these dogs have extensive training, but in their first year of life, they need to be socialized. And usually the trainers that train these dogs will send them to a foster home to spend their first year to be socialized. But recently they've been sending them to prison because most foster families work during the day and a prisoner has nothing but time. So a prisoner can spend 24/7 with an animal. But the other thing to consider too is that these animals need to be able to pay attention and not be scared by chaos and loud noise, which is exactly what the prison environment is like. So being able to send them to a prison gets them used to being around chaos and noise and learning to pay attention to their master during that. And they get more attention one-on-one because the inmate can be with them all the time. So some of these service animal trainers will send their puppies to prison for the first year of life to be socialized. And then once they're old enough to be trained, then they take them back and they start training them.
Dr. Hill,
Yep.
I have a question. What's the difference between like when they're being like socialized and they're a service animal versus like the community service model? Like, isn't it really the same thing?
No, because the community service model, they go up for adoption to the general public. Service animal socialization, these dogs are handpicked to be able to be trained for that. Or sometimes what they'll do is they'll send a whole litter of, like the trainers will send a whole litter of puppy to prison to be socialized, and then the best ones go on to the training and the others go up for adoption. But the big difference is the service animal socialization, these dogs are supposed to be going to extreme training later. Drug sniffing dogs, bomb sniffing dogs, all that stuff, a lot of them are socialized in prison. So the last type of program is animal husbandry skills. So that means it's kind of like a combination of a dog training program and a vocational program. So for instance, at Allendale Correctional Facility, they have a dog groomer program. So they have a community service model in their prison where they are training and socializing animals to go up for the general adoption for the general public. But you can also get certified to be a dog groomer, and they obviously practice on these dogs. So any sort of grooming training, you can get certified to be a trainer while you're incarcerated. Or there's even a couple of programs nationwide where you can get certified to be a vet tech. And that's usually in combination with a community service model as well. So some prisons will have all three of these. So the Gadsden prison, Gadsden Correctional Facility in Florida has all three of these programs. Some might just have two. Some might have a community service model, and the good animals will go up to further training to be a service animal. So it's not hard and fast. A prison only has one. Sometimes they have a combo of these.
Dr. Hill, with the research you've done and showing how like positively beneficial these are, would the only reason a prison wouldn't do these is just budget reasons? Does it cost too much or something? Is that really the only downside to this, or why would they not want to do this?
These are cheap as shit. I have a study coming out this year where myself and 3 other nerds did a cost benefit analysis of these programs. Prisons don't do this because they don't have a shelter nearby to partner with. Or it just doesn't fit in. Like you have to have room for the dogs to be outside. So if it just doesn't work for the layout of the prison, also occasionally you will see this in a maximum security prison, but you don't have many. There is one Perry Correctional Institution here. There's Perry in Florida, but also Perry here in South Carolina. That is a maximum security prison that has a dog training program, but that's pretty rare. So that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. Like every time there's no such thing as like where this doesn't fit. It's just up to the institution if they want it or they don't, or they can or can't get the partnership. So the eligibility criteria to participate, it varies widely, but you have to make several people happy. You have to make the warden and the correctional administrators happy, the people providing the dogs. Sometimes they'll say like, we don't want sex offenders around the dogs, right? or if you get a trainer that comes from a separate place away from the animal shelter, if they don't want to work with sex offenders or people that maybe have charges against dogs, like Michael Vick's situation, like that's usually a common excluding factor right there. If you've been involved in animal cruelty or dog fighting, you can't be in these programs. So really it varies. You just have to make all the parties happy. Now, for every time that there's a commonality that you're not allowed to participate, there is a program where you can. There's a juvenile delinquent program or in a juvenile detention center in New Mexico that takes kids that specifically have dog fighting and animal cruelty charges and puts them in this program to teach them how to interact with an animal properly. So every time there is a caveat that says they don't do this, there's one program that does it, which actually as a researcher, it makes it really hard to find an independent effect because these programs are so varied. So here in South Carolina, the Camille Graham Institution, that's the female prison up in Columbia. They have partnered with Greyhound Pets of America, and they take retired racing greyhounds and send them to the female institution and have the females there rehabilitate them, and then they adopt them out to the public. If you've ever interacted with a retired racing greyhound, they're a hot mess. Like they've never seen grass. So if you try to get them to walk on grass, they freak out. They don't know how to walk on a leash. They don't understand what stairs are. They don't understand what like a hardwood floor is. They've spent their entire life in a cage and on a racetrack. So they need a lot of work before they can go up for adoption, and the prisoners are happy to do it. So the reason I bring that up is because Greyhound Pets of America said they didn't want any inmates with child abuse charges working with their animals. But there was a woman that was incarcerated there who I met who was in there for homicide by child abuse. I had a lot of questions about that as well. It was outside the scope of my research to ask her. And she was a little standoffish at first. So I didn't want to be asking questions about her charge. Anyways, she really wanted to be a part of this program, and she'd been incarcerated for over 20 years. And she finally kind of got her shit together and was starting to behave herself. And the warden finally reached out to Greyhound Pets and was like, would you be willing to make an exception to let this one woman do it on a trial basis? She's since become their lead trainer. So every time there's one that says you can't do this, there's always a prison that does allow it somewhere. So the inmate trainer population, we've seen it with females, males, adults, juveniles, people with all kinds of charges, those with mental illnesses, those with physical ailments. There was a guy that I talked to at the Thoroughbred Retirement Program at Watery who no longer has to take his blood pressure medicine because working with the animals outside has lowered his blood pressure. So the inmate trainer population, we have not found a population that doesn't benefit from this. So let's talk about the effectiveness, and then we'll discuss the cost effectiveness as well. So I did my dissertation on this and then published a study in 2020 from it. And what I found is that these programs can reduce recidivism in the form of decreasing rearrest for any reason and rearrest for a new crime within 1 year. I could not look beyond 1 year because the group of inmates that I had that were released from this program had only been out for 1 year. So I couldn't look beyond that. So I couldn't speak beyond that. So I could only say, for the short term, I know that these programs reduce rearrest for any reason and for a new crime. I would hope that several years down the road, I didn't find any significance for reconviction or re-imprisonment, probably because only a year had gone by and it takes a while for things to go through the court system. So with that finding, I then took those findings and worked with Barbara Cook and David Farrington and my professor, William Bales. And we did a cost benefit analysis, and these programs are extremely cheap. So to answer your question, Sam, in the state of Florida, it costs 50 cents per offender per year to do these programs. The only charge comes from photocopying the trainer manual because the animal shelter pays for everything. So occasionally they'll have like $100 startup or maybe $200 to like get the dog run ready for the animals. But what we found is that even if these programs only reduce recidivism by 1%, you're still going to see a cost savings because the cost of crime is so high. So Barbara and I had to figure out the cost of crime. And it's crazy. Like vandalism is like $900. Every single drug violation for a probation violation, that's over $1,000. Who wants to guess how much a murder costs the state? What do we think? Any guesses? Nobody ever gets it right. $9 million. $9 million. This has a lot to do with, it's an average. And if you sue people after that, that's what we're also accounting for. So whenever you actually do a cost benefit analysis, you have to provide 2 figures, one including murder and one excluding murder, because sometimes researchers say it artificially inflates it. Even when we ran the numbers without murder, we still saw a huge cost savings for this, just because the programs are so cheap to implement and the cost of crime is so high that if you can like avoid 1 or 2 crimes, it's worth it.
So do you, with the information you have, do you just kind of go like give this information to prisons like, hey, dude, this works, you should try this, this will save you money, and just
So
because you have that knowledge?
I wrote up a policy brief for somebody with Nelson Mullins that was going to the legislator about this. So, I mean, I publish the findings and then it goes from there. Usually I'll have, you know, lawyers or legislators or somebody reach out to me to ask for a policy brief, and then they take it from there. So unfortunately, like we submitted that cost benefit analysis in 2019 and it's not coming out till 2021. So those figures won't be out for a really long time, but I sort of did kind of a preprint with the policy brief that I did for Nelson Mullins. Okay, questions about this? Oh, who wants to do a policy implication from this one? It's pretty simple. Who wants to do this one? And then we'll move on. Juan, how about you?
You say, what is it like? I
recommend
recommend dog training programs
to do what?
To decrease rearrest for any reason in new crime.
Very good. Perfect. There we go. Okay. So South Carolina has a lot of animal programs. So Allendale Correctional Institution has dog, cat, and beekeeping programs. Watery Correctional Institution has a thoroughbred retirement farm, a fully functioning dairy farm. Camille Graham, I went to like 5 or 6 prisons and looked at the animal programs, but our state has a lot of animal programs available. And these are the beekeeping guys right here. And I'll just tell you a small story. So you see this giant tool right here that you could definitely like brain someone with. So those are the tools that you use to pull the little beekeeping things out. And I asked about that because at that time I was also doing research for a chapter that I was writing on like potential security threats with these programs. So I was looking for things that could be shivs and whatnot. And so this guy was in charge and he said he was the only one that had the key to the little chest where they kept all these tools. And at the beginning of every shift, he hands them out. And at the end of every shift, he takes them back, counts them. And then the warden or the correctional administrators in that area would do spot checks occasionally to make sure that they weren't missing. But the chest that they kept them in, when you locked it, you could still kind of pull the gates back and stick your hand in. And so I asked him, I was like, hey, I can reach like this wooden stake right here. Like, is this a concern? And he was like, that's a shitty shiv. There are so many better things that we could use. It's not even worth our time. So apparently not a security threat. So here are just a few more pictures. I wasn't allowed to take any photographs. It's their prison has a photographer. It's actually this guy right here, this inmate who has like a super fancy camera. But they don't allow anybody, even the media, to take pictures because they don't want the layout of the prison getting out. So you can see right here, the angle that he takes the pictures, like you can't really see the layout of the prison. So here he is editing photos. Here's the inmate they had a dog dorm and a cat dorm. And I mean, they've got just animals running wild in these dorms. And when I went in to do interviews and surveys, the inmates were lined up to introduce me to their pets. And this guy who's like pushing 90, loves this fat cat right here and was so excited to show me his little trick. So Cognitive behavioral programs. This is the last program that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to give you the basics, and then we're going to talk about a local cognitive behavioral program here in town, and I'm going to show you how they do it. So cognitive behavioral programs, it's a huge paradigm in clinical psychology. And what they're saying here is that changes in behavior are achieved through changes in the way an individual perceives, reflects, and thinks about their life. So let's talk about how this program works through the assumptions that they have. So the first assumption with this program is that cognitions or your thoughts can affect your behavior, right? So if your thoughts affect your behavior, that's the first step. The second step is that people can monitor and alter their cognitive activity, right? So that you can keep track of the thoughts that you're having and you can alter your thoughts. And thirdly, that changes in thoughts or changes in your cognitions can lead to changes in your behavior. So that's the way this therapy works. First, they teach you to monitor your thoughts. Then they teach you to change your thoughts, and they're hoping by changing your thoughts, they will change your behavior. So these programs are actually extremely effective. They reduce recidivism hugely, but the only problem is they are very expensive to implement because they come with a huge manual and a lot of training to do. You're supposed to be a licensed therapist to do this, but occasionally you'll just see correctional officers that have gone through training to do it. But to buy the manual to do this and to implement these programs, it's really expensive. You actually see better cost savings with the dog training programs, even though they reduce recidivism at the fraction of what cognitive behavioral programs do. The dog training programs are so cheap to implement, it's actually cost savings compared to cognitive behavioral therapy. So in general, I'm going to give you the basics here, and then we'll go through some very specific ones in a minute. So, but just in general, during this program, clients are made aware of their maladaptive thought processes, and they're encouraged to change the way they think. And there are a number of specific manuals that you can get. The most common one is the Cognitive Thinking Skills Program, and it was created by 2 criminology researchers, and they narrowed down the thought deficits that lead to criminal behavior, such as impulsivity often leads to criminal behavior. So they'll have a whole learning module about impulsivity, and by teaching consequential thinking, you can sort of check that impulsivity. So each module is done over and over and over again. So each skill training module is delivered over several sessions with considerable overlap in material and design, because basically they want it to become second nature to you. Whereas if you recognize this thought, you know to think something else, or you know that if you have this thought, you're about to go down a path, right? So the group it's usually delivered to groups of 4 to 10 offenders, anywhere between 2 to 4 times a week. And they use all kinds of techniques because everybody learns a little bit differently. So role play, videotape feedback, modeling, group discussions, games, practical homework, as many different learning modules as they can so that it sticks with someone. So let's go over the specifics that, so I got to sit in on this in Charleston. So the Turning Leaf program, it's actually located right next to the jail, and it's offered for people that are on probation and parole. And they meet Monday through Friday. There are 2 classes a day. So there's one in the morning and one at night. It's like between 8 and 11, and then like 1 and 4 or something like that. Turning Leaf has a contract with the city of Charleston. They actually pay the offenders to go to these classes. They get paid $10 an hour, because if you think about it, if you're asking them to go to these classes Monday through Friday, they cannot work. So it's worth it for them, again, with a cost benefit analysis, to pay these offenders to go, and they will save in reduced criminal crimes. So it's a contract with the city of Charleston. They pay the offenders to go to these programs, and once they graduate, they have the opportunity to work for Charleston County. Like Ray, whose thought tracker we're going to look at in a minute, was applying to work as a garbage man for the city of Charleston because he had just graduated. They also have a screen printing business there that the inmates can, or the parolees or probationers can work while they're there. If you ever need a t-shirt printed, they can do it for you for a really great price, and they do a great job. So the class is very interactive. I sat in on 2 of them. It utilizes group discussions, role-playing lessons, homework. They let me take a bunch of pictures of their lessons. There are a lot of really small rewards too, because remember, these guys either spent a great deal of time in prison or grew up in a very shitty environment. So keeping them entertained and constantly sort of giving them little prizes means a great deal to them. So for instance, they get raffle tickets when they do things correctly, like being on time, wearing their uniform, just a Turning Leaf t-shirt, doing their homework, participating, and then intermittently they'll draw a raffle, choose a raffle winner, and they get a $5 gift certificate to the dollar store, and they love it. They get so excited about it. They get a sticker for each class they attend. Once they get 10 stickers, they get access to free snacks. Very exciting for them. It keeps them engaged. It's based on a strict hierarchy, and this is pretty common for cognitive behavioral programs. You move through 3 levels, and you can get moved back down a level for doing things improperly. With this program, if you fail a drug test, they just move you down a level. They don't report it to your probation or your parole officer, because that will probably send you straight back, and they want to keep moving forward with progress. All right, so they used to offer another program called Thinking for a Change. It was just a different model of cognitive behavioral. It used to be offered to the inmates at Al Cannon Detention Center, but they stopped doing that a couple of years ago. So let's look at some of the lessons. So here you can see some of the lessons they learned. The last session that I observed, Joe, the teacher, he is a retired preacher who's turned into a hilarious potty mouth. He gave a short lecture about the difference between assertive behavior, passive aggressive behavior, and aggressive behavior. And I think this is really interesting to hear after we just learned about their experience being in prison with prison subculture. So they all had to write down 3 situations, and then as a whole class, they went over them, and we discussed whether they acted assertively, passive aggressively, or aggressively. And then they had to act out a recent situation in which they acted passive aggressively or aggressively. And they had to talk about their thoughts at the time, and they would go like this to indicate that they were having a thought. And then they would have to redo it in an assertive manner. And this included body language. Like, for instance, one guy was acting out a time that he was being yelled at by a customer. He was a parking attendant. I actually ran into him downtown. He still works as a parking attendant downtown. He was working as a parking attendant, and the guy was like upset with him, and he did sort of a role play. And as a class, Joe was pointing out, like, you realize your fists are clenched and you've angled your body so that you've essentially sort of pinned this person against a wall. It was just something that he hadn't even noticed. So little things like that. They also went over ways to calm themselves down. So things like visualization. So think of a happy memory, counting backwards, deep breathing. They went through a bunch of them. So whichever one works for you, they want to teach you when you're having these thoughts to do these things and to remember to sort of relax, unclench your fist, take a step back so that you're not like crowding someone. So if you think about the impression management that we talked about with the reading, I mean, that becomes second nature to them living in an institution. And we're basically trying to teach them not to act like that anymore. All right, so we're going to go over a horribly inappropriate lesson that they did, but I think it's hilarious, and it's just the reality of these guys' lives. So every night they had to do a thought tracker, and they would come in and write it on a piece of paper, and we would go over it as a class. So let me show you. So they had to come up with a triggering situation. They had to list the action, and they had to list their thoughts. And then in the green, as a class, we went over the number 1 thoughts that they had that led to the action. And we discussed if it was a high risk or a low risk thought, an action or a non-action thought. So for Ray, this was the triggering situation that got his probation revoked one of the times he was incarcerated. So someone offered him a large amount of drugs that would put good money in his pocket. And his action was he took the drugs. So he went through the thoughts, and then he circled the thoughts that led to this action. So his first, and I had to have these translated because I'm a little white girl and I didn't understand them. So I will translate them for you as well. So the first thought was, I'm about to be all the way on, which means he's about to have a lot of money in his pocket. This was, we decided as a class, high risk, non-action thought. Number 2, I need to come up. He was poor and he needed money. In this particular situation, he had back child payment due, and he was about to get in a lot of trouble if he did not produce money for his child. So he did not have a job at this point. This was a high risk non-action thought. Third, shit real hard out here. High risk non-action. High risk non-action. 4, my street already pumping, which means that there were plenty of buyers for the drugs. He knew he could sell them really quickly. He said he made like $500 in just like 10 or 15 minutes. So this was a high risk and an action thought. So this led directly into him buying the drugs. He knew he could flip a profit really quickly. I got people I could put on. He knew exactly who to call to flip those drugs really quickly. That was, he thought, a low risk thought, but an action thought. I feel like that's pretty high risk. 6, fuck the police. We all agreed that this was a high risk, but non-action thought. 7, it's all about getting money. High risk, right into action. 8, I've been down for too long. High risk, non-action. So the thoughts that he had that led him to buying the drugs were shit real hard out here. My street already pumping. Fuck the police. It's all about getting money. I've been down for too long. So doing this over and over, like what we're supposed to remember from this is that if he starts having these thoughts again, like he knows he's about to go down a road that is not going to go anywhere good. So this was a pretty common thought, or when they went through a lot of these thought trackers, and this was a pretty common one that someone offered them a quick way to make money illegally and they took it. Another really common one was that their girl called them to come over for a booty call and they didn't have a driver's license and they drove anyways. And then they got busted and then they wound up back in jail. I saw about 5 thought trackers like that, and there was only like 8 people in the class. So those were the pretty common thought trackers. Either they just needed money really fast or they wanted their booty call. So these are some real examples. You can actually, probably not now during COVID, but these classes were open to the public. If you wanted to attend them, you just contact the people with Turning Leaf and you can sit in on these classes. And I'm telling you, like my stomach hurt. I was laughing so hard. These guys were hilarious and they were so thankful for this program. They were like, whatever research you do, make sure you know like how well this is working. This has changed my life. It was nice to see all of these guys. Like, I think Ray was one who had been incarcerated in federal prison for like 20 years on drug trafficking. So for him, it was just super helpful to help him sort of deprogram when he came out of prison. All right. Questions? No questions? All righty. Well, just as a quick reminder, Joseph, Carlos, Ethan, and John Minch, you 3 do not take your quiz today. Everybody else, make sure you take it. It will open in 11 minutes and you can take it anytime from now until Saturday at 10 a.m. So make sure you take that quiz and don't forget your 5th question is going to be name a policy implication from this lecture. It has to be from this lecture. Don't give me a deterrence one, okay? All right, everybody have a nice weekend and I will see you on Monday.
Dr. Hill?
Yes.
I joined a couple minutes late. Did you get me on the roll?
I don't take roll. Y'all are adults.
Okay.
Don't worry about that.
Have a good weekend.
All right, you too. Bye.
Hi, is there like any time that you have like